and welcome to the second webinar in the directed webinar series, Building Resilience Through Data, Governance, and Communication. In our first session, we explored the concept and the practice of real-world labs in directed. Recordings are available on social media for you to rewatch. Today's session is titled Governance in Crisis, Decision-Making Under Uncertainty. Across Europe and globally, decision makers are increasingly facing crises characterized by uncertainty, cascading risks, incomplete information, and rapidly changing situations. At the same time, disaster risk management and climate change adaptation require collaboration across many different actors, including local authorities, emergency responders, science, civil society organizations, and the communities at risk. This webinar explores how governance approaches and collaborative tools can help stakeholders work together more effectively under these conditions. Today, we will focus particularly on the development of the Risk-Tandem Framework and tandem collaboration tools and how they have been applied through the directed project. These approaches are designed to support co-production, stakeholder engagement, and collaborative planning, helping different actors better understand each other's needs, perspectives, and decision-making environments. We are delighted to welcome speakers from the Research Institute for Sustainability RIFS at GFZ Helmholtz Center for Geoscience, the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI in Oxford, and colleagues working directly with communities and practitioners in directed's real-world labs. You in the audience are able to interact with the speakers through the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will respond to questions towards the end of the webinar. Copies of the slides and further information can also be found in the resource section in Zoom. With that context in mind, I would like to now introduce Dr. Pia Johanna Schweitzer from the Research Institute for Sustainability at GFZ in Potsdam. Pia has led the research group Systemic Risks since joining the RIFS in 2016. The research group analyzes the complex interface of technology, society, and the environment regarding systemic risks, such as climate change, and paying particular attention to complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity in this field. Pia studied sociology and English American studies at the University of Stuttgart and the University of Aberdeen in UK. She received her doctorate in sociology from the University of Stuttgart in 2008 on the topic of discursive risk regulation. Before joining RIFS, Pia worked as a researcher at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Stuttgart. And from 2013 to 14, she was also a visiting scholar at Michigan State University in the US at the Center for Systemic Integration and Sustainability. Now, over to you, Pia.
Thank you so much, Max, for the introduction. My talk will focus on one of the innovations that we produced in the project directed that addresses governance challenges in particular, decision-making and uncertainty in particular. So one of the key challenges that we are facing today is interoperable communication and governance, and how to make coordination and communication possible across multiple governance levels, but also mandates and across different time scales. This is where we start off with our problem in the directed project. We assume that disaster resilience very much depends on both data and models and information that is available, but also on coordination across institutions and sectors and scales. And this is why governance in this regard is so important and stands out, because governance, in our understanding, includes all the rules and methods and ways in which and how we take decisions on risk in a coordinated and evidence-based manner. But we are faced with a major barrier here, which is a lack of interoperability, a lack of connection and coordination between institutions and responsibilities. That also pertains to communication channels and the decision-making routines. So when we try to aim to integrate disaster risk management, climate change adaptation, the current governance setup is not up to speed. And this is where many practitioners are faced today. The couple of governance challenges stand out. And we saw that through multiple case studies. One of them, the 2021 major flood event in Germany, for instance, where we saw that extreme events, extreme hydrological events such as this one, actually do test the limits of our existing disaster risk management systems. And many lessons can be learned from experience such as this. There is definitely a lack of data and information, but that's not all. There are also failures of communication, coordination, and then also how risk information is passed on and to whom this information is available and who needs to have the necessary knowledge to actually act upon that information. So first governance challenge is fragmented responsibilities. Sure, disaster risk management and climate change adaptation are distributed across many institutions. Also depends on your specific country. There might be different responsibilities and also administrative levels and sectors involved here. But also how disaster risk management, this cycle, prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, how that is organized in itself. Also, that is often handled by different departments, different sectors within the same ministry authority or sort of in other houses. So bridging these kind of gaps and sort of making that kind of communication and coordination work in also a crisis mode, but especially tackling challenging. So we see that there are definitely gaps between the phases of the disaster risk management cycle, but also between disaster risk management and climate change adaptation planning as such. So two challenges here, actually. The next governance challenge that we work on is the integration of disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. So disaster risk management tends actually to focus on the immediate preparedness, response, and recovery. So more also looking at data, empirical data that of course is kind of like backwards looking because you need the empirical evidence, whereas climate change adaptation is a future-oriented activity per se. So it works with the longer term impacts of climate change, thus also with longer term horizons, planning horizons. And that also means that climate change will alter and actually already has altered how hazard patterns unfold, how exposure unfolds, and then also which communities are actually vulnerable or at risk. So this coordination, this combination of this more immediate, more short-term emergency management and the more longer-term adaptation process, this is really a bridge for us, for our directorate, where we've been working on and where our tools and approaches stand out. Another governance challenge is definitely the data, information, to knowledge and action gap. This is the classic of the social sciences, because we know that although we might have the data, we might actually also have the knowledge to know what to do with the data. Action does not necessarily follow. And that doesn't always have to do with people simply not acting upon information or lack of follow through, but also implementation barriers. They're often reasons why this gap actually exists. And this is also one of the key points that we analyzed and that we worked on throughout the directed project, that we really want to understand from the real world labs perspective where these implementation gaps actually show up and how we can address them in practice and also longer term. Fourth challenge is touching upon normative issues. Here we see that actually disaster risk management and climate change adaptation decision-making does involve, of course, scientific uncertainty, but there is also ambiguity about the interpretation of outcomes. What might be a good outcome for one societal group might be a bad outcome or considered a bad outcome for another societal group. So evaluative judgments here are really key and must be made. So there are also contestations about, for instance, what should be protected, who should be protected, what losses matter most to whom, and what's an acceptable way of dealing with that. And all of these challenges, we try to address actually with our key innovation, the Risk-Tandem Framework here, which works with both the risk governance, sort of this cyclical approach towards disaster risk management. That's the middle part here, with the classical setting the focus, then doing the characterization and evaluation and management, this kind of working with risk. But the core component is the tandem framework, tandem approach, where knowledge co-production happens. My colleague Sukaina will speak to that later on, and also how we picked up on that will be followed up by colleagues in this webinar. But then also the focus areas, sort of the institutions, the rules of the game, what are the bounds within which we need to navigate in our real world labs. That's really key here, that we bring all of this together, sort of combining risk governance, but with knowledge co-production, so that locally owned and locally led solutions are really put into practice. And this then also helps to tailor the solutions to the local context and helps with longer term sustainability. We have also developed indicators because, you know, any kind of framework is, in essence, sort of the aim is that it's transferable across different regions. But what you need for putting frameworks into practice are indicators, that's for sure. You need to operationalize this framework. And our indicators focus on 3 dimensions. One is a mapping of the regulatory and institutional context so that we can actually tailor the application and the solutions to the specific context that matters. Then also to current risk management practice and risk knowledge, and where there might be sort of still space for improvement. And then key here, the collaborative mechanisms of knowledge co-production. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Sukaina. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. We'll now move from the governance context and explore some of the practical tools and collaborative approaches developed for the Tandem Framework. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sukaina Barwani from the Stockholm Environment Institute in Oxford. Sukaina is an interdisciplinary senior researcher with a background in both social anthropology and computer science. Sukaina co-led the SEI Climate Services Initiative and has led several work streams in large European and international projects. She also serves as director of the WeAdapt global platform and network for climate change adaptation. Her past research supported urban adaptation in Southern Africa and now connects communities working on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Europe, whilst also contributing to the field of climate change adaptation taxonomies. She currently leads work streams in various Horizon Europe projects, and in Directed, she leads the work package on inter- and transdisciplinary knowledge co-production. Sukaina was contributing author to the IPCC's 6th assessment report in Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. She holds a PhD in applied computing in social science and a BA in social anthropology. So now over to you, Sukaina.
Thank you so much, Max. So building on what Pia presented, I would like to go a little bit deeper into the principles underpinning Risk-Tandem. I will briefly describe some of the underlying co-production and collaborative learning approach that Pia alluded to help us deal with these different types of uncertainties that she described. And this is using the underlying co-production approach Tandem, which supports stakeholders in working together across the full cycle of adaptation processes. So while Risk-Tandem is also looking at systemic risk assessment, Tandem tries to bring in some of those relational, institutional, and learning dimensions that are required to sustain this long-term collaboration between science, policy, and practice. And many of these sort of quite tricky relational and intangible elements that often result in success or failure of different interventions. So one of the values of the co-production process is that it is a process rather than a product necessarily, and going through the adaptation cycle together in tandem with stakeholders is as important as any end product, model, or tool that might be developed. And this is something we have learned through various experiences we've had applying these approaches, and something we really want to make as core and fundamental to the engagements in Directed and with our real-world labs. So here you can see we've staged the Risk-Tandem process into different co-production and capacity development stages in the project through the foundation, growth, learn, and sustain phases. And zooming into this framework are the 4 mirrored stages of Tandem, which you can see here on the right. So to preface the rest of what I wanted to share, and what colleagues will share also in terms of putting Tandem and Risk-Tandem into practice, an important point of departure for us in the development and application of this framework is that the process of co-production can in fact develop capacity of both stakeholders and scientists in a sort of dialectical iterative process. So stakeholders' capacity can be developed in a variety of areas, such as better understanding of climate and other types of data, increasing climate and governance literacy, developing the awareness and the openness to enable a shared understanding of different viewpoints, developing listening, deep listening skills, and reflexive skills, as well as facilitation in itself. And for scientists and researchers, capacity can be developed in better understanding the decision domain itself and the decision context, and an appreciation of why this is important can materialize through the co-production process when it's done well. But on the point of how effective co-production can be, there is less reflection. Although there's lots of co-production work that happens, there's often less reflection on how effective co-production is. So just as Pia mentioned, the indicators that we really see as important in evaluating how risk governance is taking place and how effective the framework is, we are also really interested and trying to reflect all the time on how effective this co-production process is. What difference does it make to the real world labs that we're working with? How does it change ways of working and it change practice? So going further, as we propose that co-production informs, shapes, and further refines the capacity development of participants who engage in it, but there is little or no analysis of how there's little or no analysis or assessment of how this takes place and how effective it is and what it means for adaptation work. We've dug a little bit deeper into this. So we've found key capacities around collaboration, systems thinking, creativity, reflexivity, alongside the development of the related skills around literacy, climate literacy, and governance literacy, and facilitation to be the strongest things that have come out of this work. And this is reflected in the application of Risk-Tandem in the different phases seen here. And what's really important is capacity needs assessments and evaluations have been deliberately carried out throughout this process to continuously refine, iterate, adapt, and learn from what worked and what didn't work throughout our engagements. So if we zoom into the 4 stages separately of Tandem itself, you'll find more detail at each stage of the process, as shown here on the right. And this is an interactive tool, an interactive guide that can take you through each stage of the process. And alongside this, we have also produced a sort of interactive PDF, you could call it, with different elements describing how the modules for the interactive online guidance have been shaped and can be used. And this is hosted on the WeAdapt platform, and you can find that here at the link. And going beyond what is good practice in a good co-production process, as well as the interactive guidance, Tandem is also full of examples and exercises and even Miro canvases like this one that help you carry out these exercises. So this shows you how to carry out each stage of the process and what it might lead to and how it might support stakeholders throughout the process. So as well as showing what's important at each stage, we're trying to go a little bit further as well and provide real practical guidance on what can work and how to apply it and how to tailor it at each stage. So in directed, for example, rather than treating adaptation and DRR as separate policy or technical domains, as Pia mentioned, the approach tries to support actors to move collectively through different stages of knowledge co-production and action by jointly framing challenges and jointly sort of co-creating a consensus around the challenges that should be addressed. And through this, building partnerships and better relationships, better networks, stronger collaboration across departments, for example, through a better understanding of the shared challenges that each might be addressing through different ways and through different lenses. So this is particularly important in the context of escalating climate risks and systemic uncertainty, as Pia shared, where fragmented governance, disconnected evidence systems, and short-term project cycles, amongst other things, can often limit effective adaptation. So this continuous learning and reflection through a joint understanding of shared challenges is where this really comes into practice. So we really see Tandem as offering a systemic and replicable, robust approach that tries to incorporate context-specific specificity, while also allowing a generalizable framework to be tailored to different needs. And the exercises and the interactive guidance that I shared take you through the process of how that might happen. So we will share now through the real world labs how Tandem and Risk-Tandem have been applied in practice to support this transdisciplinary collaboration around locally grounded adaptation and resilience challenges. And to preface that, I'll just say that in the early scoping, connecting, and co-exploring stages that you can see here, we try and help the labs develop a shared understanding of the climate risk, the vulnerabilities, and the governance contexts that stakeholders might be facing. And through this process, this iterative process, which takes time and requires many engagements, it can help to strengthen relationships and trust across institutions and different sectors that may not have worked together before. So the trust and the relationship building and some of this intangible sort of relational tissue and fabric is really what's key to ensuring effective implementation. And during the co-designing stage, researchers and practitioners and decision makers have worked together to identify the barriers, trade-offs of different solutions and integrate scientific and local knowledge at the same time to develop more context-sensitive adaptation and DRR responses. And then the monitoring and reflective cross-cutting elements that you see in the center of this diagram have supported testing approaches in the different real-world lab settings, to helping stakeholders to evaluate what works, how strategies may need to be adapted over time, integrating new knowledge, and to help identify and support the enabling conditions for scaling and sustaining this action. So going back to that sustained stage, which is actually where we're at now in the project. So an important point is that the labs help us demonstrate that co-production is not simply about stakeholder engagement, but it is about transforming how knowledge is generated and shared and used across the adaptation and DRR systems across time. We also have a lot of cross peer-to-peer learning across the real-world labs, trying to help enable the co-creation that is generated that might be different in different contexts to also be shared, and those processes to be shared. And while the learning might result in different strategies over time, there is real value in that sharing. That is what we have found. And by linking the climate risk analysis, the vulnerability analysis, as well as the preparedness and long-term adaptation planning across the stages of the framework, we hope, and hopefully the case studies that we will be generating over the next few months will show, we hope that this supports a more integrated, inclusive, and implementation-oriented resilience approach that can be replicated across different regional and local contexts. And I think with that, I will leave it there and hand over to Natasha and our real-world lab hosts, who will share some examples of how actually this has been put into practice and what some of the outcomes have been.
Thank you so much, Sukaina. Yes, building further on this theoretical foundation that Pia and Sukaina laid out, we will now hear from Natasha NG from SEI Oxford, who will share her experience using the framework in applied workshop and stakeholder settings. Natasha is a design researcher working on co-production and capacity development in the Directed project. Natasha employs systems thinking, design mapping, and other creative methods, along with community organizing methodologies to facilitate co-design for transitions. Prior to joining SEI, Natasha worked as a researcher at the University of the Arts London, UAL, where she applied design for transitions thinking to co-define problems and co-create pathways for socially just and ecologically sustainable transitions. Facilitating partnerships between UAL and Citizens UK, Natasha has successfully led creative campaigns, programs, and research initiatives, achieving lasting impact through the strong relationships and partnerships built. She holds a BA from Cardiff University and a master's degree in Global Collaborative Design Practice from the dual award program offered by the University of the Arts London and the Kyoto Institute of Technology. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks, Pia and Sukaina, also for going before. So I get the pleasure of showing how we've put this into practice. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, brilliant. Sorry. So I'm going to be sharing some work from the Directed project on how we've taken the Risk-Tandem Framework and we've applied it within our real-world lab settings. And I'm going to walk you through two concrete applications, a tabletop exercise in Germany, our Rhine-Erft real-world lab, and a multi-criteria analysis exercise in the capital region of Denmark. So let's start with the first case study, where we ran a role play exercise with the stakeholders in Rhine-Erft, and I'll explain what we did, why, and what we found. So this slide just shows you a little bit about the stakeholder landscape in Rhine-Erft, and what you can see immediately is a lot of complexity. And we have the Erftverband at the centre because they're our lab host. They're the water board, and they are surrounded by districts, public agencies, departments for hazard prevention, civil protection, etc. And some of these actors are focused on disaster risk management, and others are focused on climate change adaptation, and some span both. And understanding this landscape was really essential before we started organising and designing any sort of collaborative exercise. And so when we were in the tandem scoping and co-explore phase that Sakina was talking about a second ago, the stakeholders in the region pulled out sort of two distinct categories of challenges. Firstly, on the operational side, that there was difficulties in communication flows between actors, both before, during, and after events, finding that they were fragmented, that people weren't always getting the right information at the right time, or communicating with others what the actions that they were taking. And then also on the governance side, that disaster risk management and climate change adaptation interventions were not connected or considered in a connected space. And so they were treated as different domains, managed by different teams with different timescales and objectives, but yet they're very deeply intertwined. And so the question became, how do we design an exercise that forces participants to confront both of these challenges at the same time? So our response was a tabletop exercise, which we based on the extreme floods that were experienced across Europe in 2021, and particularly also in Rhine-Erft. And in our exercise, random chance cards arrived, continuously sort of compounding players' risks and ramping up the pressures. And paper slips also kept coming to deliver new points of view and data, almost to the point of overwhelm. And the players had to swap teams to experience the same situation, but from a different point of view, from a different team. And it forced players to work together, this sort of, we called it camaraderie in the chaos, to understand what is happening and competently manage the unexpected. And so we structured it across 3 phases, and we limited this to just 3 days at a time. So the pre-event phase, the event phase, and the post-event. And critically, we built in reflection points where participants were asked to talk about what worked, what didn't, is it realistic in real life? If not, what would need to change? And what would you change if you knew about this in a month, or you knew about this a year earlier or 5 years earlier? And this was important because it bridged the gap between the short-term disaster response and the longer-term adaptation planning. And thinking about, what worked and didn't work and what needed to change gave us immediate ideas for actions and first steps, or that low-hanging fruit that we could work with. So this is the canvas that the participants used during the exercise, and they had a sheet like this for the pre-event, the event, and the post-event. And each actor receives information, either hazard, data, or warnings or updates, or communication from other participants. And then they had to assess the impacts, as well as dealing with cascading impacts delivered by chance cards, and think about the actions taken and the communication to send. And this was a crucial moment where fragmentation challenges became visible. In the exercise, groups often found that communications were duplicated or delayed or sent to the wrong people, and the actions taken by one agency weren't necessarily known by another agency, and it mirrored the real-world experience. So what did we learn? We've mapped here the outcomes onto the tandem framework because we found that first, it, as an exercise, really helped as part of the co-explore process. So identifying those points of intervention. And in this case, there was the introduction of a WebEx meeting in the pre-event phase as a sort of practical improvement. We found that it also worked as an appraisal method to test whether these interventions worked. And And then thirdly, capacity building. So cross-cutting across all of Tandem, understanding how other agencies worked, improving that collaboration and that reflexivity and that trust. And so the WebEx meeting, just to tell you a little bit more, but I'm sure Julian, who's with us, can also tell you about it, was they realized there was nowhere for them to all come together before an event when they knew the forecast exceeded a certain threshold to say, okay, this is how we're going to tackle it. How are you thinking about it? And it was helpful because that's actually a pretty simple thing to implement, but has a lot of impact. So now I will move on to the second case study, which is the multi-criteria analysis activity that we ran with the stakeholders in Denmark. And this was based within Roskilde Ford. We had those from wider, but we just used a case study from Roskilde Ford. And it's a different type of challenge from the tabletop exercise. Here, the central problem isn't necessarily about communication fragmentation. It's about how do you make decisions when you have technically complex data and stakeholders with fundamentally different values and priorities. And so again, here's another map with a mix of local authorities, federal agencies, emergency responders, all of which have different priorities and have different actors sitting within them that have different priorities. So the two challenges that we'd identified here, or the lab had identified, was technical challenges. That modeling data is technically rich, but often inaccessible and doesn't really mean much to people who are not technical. And then governance challenges. So climate adaptation measures require choices between options that reflect different values and priorities. A dike might be really great for flood protection, but it's controversial for visual impact or cost. A managed retreat might make hydrological sense, but be politically or socially unacceptable. And so the question is, how do you have a structured, productive conversation about these trade-offs across different actors? And our response was a multi-criteria analysis exercise, which I'm going to call an MCA exercise to make it a little bit less of a mouthful. And this is an established decision support methodology that allows different options to be evaluated against multiple criteria, and you can give the criteria different weights. And these criteria can reflect different values, not just technical performance. And we adapted it for a participatory workshop setting. As you can see in the photos, it was very hands-on, just like the tabletop exercise, really facilitating conversation. I think it's nice that you can see everyone sort of stood up around the table rather than, sitting down. They were really involved. And so the overall process, which is probably going to be a little bit quick in just in 30 seconds to go over, but don't worry, we've got more resources. I'll come to it. Basically involves identifying the overall goal, which in our case was selecting the best interventions for managing flood risk, and sort of fixing a storyline. So we gave a scripted storyline to all of the participants. And then we mapped the stakeholders and assigned roles. And these roles, we sort of pre-wrote out, you're so-and-so, and you've got these priorities. So it was a bit more role play again. And then first they thought individually about what their values and criteria would be. And then they collectively developed a goal hierarchy. So thinking about their collective criterias and breaking that down into overall goal, criterias for those, and then indicators for those criteria. And then we explored different measures and thought about how those measures would be evaluated against those criteria. And we got them to sort of send off research commission reports. So they had to say, we want to understand how these criteria would be assessed against these indicators. And then quickly over lunch, we sort of pulled out some values for them so that they could play around with what happened when they weighted criteria differently, how it shifted the scores of which measure scored best. Obviously, if this was done in a real world situation, you probably wouldn't do it in one afternoon. You would give more time to think about those, the ways in which those research commissions are done. So what did we learn? Again, I've mapped these onto the tandem dimensions. So first, one of the most powerful shifts in the MCA is it moves modeling data away from being seen as the answer, and it shows it as a tool for structured conversation. And this is really important because it means the model doesn't make the decision. It informs a deliberative process between the people that need to make the decision. And then the exercise makes explicit the different criteria that each stakeholders are bringing to an evaluation. Cost, ecological impact, social acceptability, flood protection performance. And these often pull in different directions, and the MCA creates a shared vocabulary for discussing why. And then third, by going through this process together, participants from different institutions and sectors develop a much richer understanding of each other's constraints and priorities, which is foundational to any collaboration. So I've got a short video here that sort of is from the colleagues that were at the MCA workshop and talking about what they got out of it.
Hvad lærte du til workshoppen om multikriterieanalyser?
Det er, når man sætter sig sammen med forskellige roller, at man så kan løfte et projekt og få mange forskellige perspektiver på bordet, så det bliver et bedre projekt sammen. Og så en metodik til, hvordan man kan få de her tanker konkretiseret, og så vi kan få de bedste løsninger ud af det sammen.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is different perspective from different sectors coming together and seeing how we understand things differently was very interesting.
Det var nok at se det fra mange andre perspektiver end kun mit eget. Jeg ser det kun fra dataperspektivet, og det er interessant at se de politiske ting, der kan være inde over i en beslutning, og se alle de interesser, der er.
I think my key takeaway was how you have to prioritize a lot when emergency planning, and you have to prioritize the value of different criteria. And that process is way harder than I would have expected.
It really gave me a broad understanding of how important prioritizing and planning actually is for like the municipalities, for climate adaptation, and also for my role. I can now go back and like brainstorm which other products or services we could even develop even more. Hvordan kan multikriterieanalyser understøtte dig i dit arbejde?
Jeg tror, det kan hjælpe mig til at få samlet de input fra alle mulige forskellige interessenter, både internt i kommunen, men faktisk også med borgere og interesseorganisationer, så vi får nogle meget bedre belyste projekter fremadrettet i Roskilde Kommune.
In my team, we're currently developing a digital risk map to visualize risk in different municipalities. And this workshop will help us in that development because we are aware of new criteria, and maybe we're actually going to incorporate this thing about the social values, which haven't been a part of it until now.
I don't think it's crystallized yet exactly what the uses will be, but I think it has some very nice potential because it's very important to access a given solution in weighing different criteria against each other, and that's what we already do, but having a method for it would be very helpful.
Jeg tror generelt til, ikke kun for mig, men for en kommune som helhed, at de aktører i en højvandssituation, der skal arbejde sammen om at vælge en løsning, at der kan man vægte sine kriterier sammen, sådan at det bliver en helhedsløsning, som giver de bedste forudsætninger for borgerne og for trygheden i kommunen.
Thank you. And so very, very quickly, like I said, that was just a whistle-stop tour of the tools that we use, but we have created learning resources and how-to guides, because we really want the legacy of this project to be in the replicability, and we want these methods not to just stay within the project, but for others to use them. So here you can see we've developed a how-to guide for running the MCA workshop again, providing all the resources. It walks the facilitators through the process step by step, materials, timings, and then to complement this, we've built an MCA demonstration tool, which allows you to play around with changing your criterion weightings for measures to understand how these choices change the rankings of which measures score best. And then secondly, our tandem modules, like Sakina said, build on the work with the labs and provide guidance more broadly on how to design and facilitate either a full co-production cycle and co-design cycle, as well as individual exercises. So how to design a tabletop exercise or how to design a multi-criteria exercise in your context. So I will pass back to Max.
Thank you so much, Natasha. We'll now move into the panel discussion of today's webinar, bringing together our speakers and colleagues from directed real-world labs to reflect on how these governance and collaboration approaches that you've learned about work in practice. And for that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Julian Struck, Project Manager of the Intermunicipal Flood Protection Cooperation Erft at Erftverband, who leads our Rhine-Erft real-world lab, and Dominik Hederich, Risk Consultant and Broker at Genila & Co., an independent broking and consulting service in the insurance industry, who leads our Danube real-world lab. This will be an interactive discussion rather than a formal presentation, allowing us to explore practical experiences, lessons learned, and also wider reflections from across the directed projects. And I'd like to begin with our real-world lab participants and hosts, Julian and Dominik. From your perspective, what was different about the Risk-Tandem and tandem approaches compared to more traditional stakeholder engagement or planning processes that you used before in your daily work? And did any of these novelties in Risk-Tandem surprise you? And I'd first like to hear from you, Julian. Can you tell us about your perspective as a member of a water board?
Sure. Thank you, Max. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you clearly.
Nice. I would say that unlike traditional stakeholder engagement approaches, the tandem and Risk-Tandem approach gave us the opportunity to interact with our real-world lab stakeholders in more detail. Moreover, these approaches gave our stakeholders the possibility to step into the shoes of other organizations and sectors, to explore communication channels and their strengths and weaknesses in more detail. And if you ask about the surprise factor, I'm a bit surprised by how enthusiastically our stakeholders have been working with us in this entire process during the last years.
So you feel there was a real thirst for approaches like this in your work?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
Because the interaction between the water authorities and the actors from disaster risk management really increased during the last years.
Yeah, that's very encouraging to hear and to experience. It means we all should be using more of these collaborative co-design approaches. And I would also like to hear from you, Dominik, how the Risk-Tandem worked in an insurance context, because that's very different from the water board. Please, could you reflect on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me too. I think one of the things we really appreciated about the Risk-Tandem approach from the start was that it brought a wide range of stakeholders together around one table. And typically the insurance industry, like let's say they stick to themselves, and with the Risk-Tandem approach, it made it possible to directly include different perspectives and hands-on experience of local practitioners, especially when it comes to structures, governance challenges, potential future developments in the technical flood risk analysis, and all together build a common foundation of understanding. And this is something that, from our perspective specifically, also, I think, helped the participating insurers to gain a much better understanding about the views, the limitations, and also priorities of other stakeholder groups that were involved.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. And were these co-production processes used before in your work, or was this rather new also to your stakeholders?
I think it was rather new because typically you, like most of the time, meet online, and with meeting online, the possibilities to even do, for example, what Natasha has introduced, multi-criteria assessment analysis, it isn't really possible. So on the one hand, it really enhanced the exchange of information on a, let's say, different level, and also connect with stakeholder groups, and also enabled different stakeholder groups that weren't in touch so far to connect with each other, and not only, let's say, exchange information, but also get to know each other, let's say, more personally, and get a better understanding really about how the other ones think about their work, about what their perspective is more in detail.
Yeah, it's about this creating of a common understanding of the subject and being able to see from someone else's perspective the contexts of a certain decision-making situation, as we also heard from the Danish colleagues in the video. Thank you, Dominic. I would like to zoom out again a little bit, and there are globally these themes of emerging crises that are becoming more interconnected and highly uncertain. And I would like to ask you, Pia, how do you think that the governance structures that you have mentioned that are maybe not always up to speed, how they should evolve to better deal with these conditions that they are faced with?
Right. This is of course also a bit of a context-specific question, because some countries have a federal system, others are more centralized. So we, of course, navigate within the bounds of regulation. But what is a common denominator, I'd say, is that we need to listen to various voices in these contested times. So we actually need to have these tough conversations about also diverging expectations, diverging values. So this also relates to the responsibilities of governmental authorities. How much should be sort of on the state? How much should be on the individual person? For instance, with regards to insurance, you need to insure your own property, or your real estate. These kinds of questions that we see now surfacing, that's what we need to really work on. And sort of these frameworks that we presented, they are, of course, first conceptual frameworks. What they really live, where they really sort of have their strength, is in the application. And that is quite context specific, depending on the specific region. But it does provide a heuristic. It does provide an approach that will help to unpack these kinds of questions and to have these kinds of debates, actually.
Thank you. And if you had to generalize a little bit from the experience in the directed project, what do you identify as the main challenges for institutions to adapt to these uncertain risk situations and adapt these co-development processes in their workflows?
Right. I think one of the prime examples is sort of a really cool experience from my perspective as a researcher, as an academic, is actually the application of the Risk-Tandem Framework in the Rhine-Erft region, and sort of Julian's real world lab that he's the host of. There we saw, I mean, as you could expect, Germany is a well-regulated country, to put it diplomatically, so there are rules in place. But nevertheless, of course, there are challenges of coordination and communication. And at this point, I'd actually like to hand over to Julian, because they found a cool way, an innovative way of addressing communication and coordination issues that do not overstep the boundaries and mandates of the authorities.
Okay, thank you, Pia. So shortly about the WebEx meeting, Natasha has mentioned it earlier. So we as a Erftverband are not part of the emergency response chain or the so-called warning chain. However, we maintain a dense network of gauges and climate stations in our catchment area, and we are able to provide information, data, and also data interpretation, speaking about data uncertainties or model uncertainties, etc. To our disaster risk management stakeholders. And currently, we are doing this through an informal online meeting, so the WebEx meeting, as a governance mechanism. As soon as the Erftverband goes on standby in the event of a flood event. And then we invite the DRM actors to this information meeting, and we discuss about the model results, the given data, and the uncertainties. And we we meet in in a certain amount of time, so every hour again and again, and we discuss the situation in the area of impacted by the flood before and during and also after the event. So I guess this is a best summarize.
Thank you so much, Julian. And maybe one last question, and if I may, I would ask for a rather brief answer. There's obviously already a lot of frameworks out there. But how does now the Tandem, the Risk-Tandem Framework, how does that add value to all these existing frameworks out there? So Keina, could you reflect on that again? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Max. It's a really good question. And I think there are many good frameworks out there that provide a lot of great guidance on what needs to be done. But I think what we're trying to do here is really focus on identifying the more intangible elements that are needed to support these kind of long-term to address these complex challenges and provide sort of long-term sustainable solutions that can respond to such challenges. And this, I think what's come out really strongly and what we've heard is the values and preferences and the potential contestations and the things that need to be surfaced to identify a shared challenge can be quite difficult and require a lot of trust. They require time, they require really strong relationships. And this is often between people who haven't worked together previously. So I think what we're trying to do is almost develop the intangible, the fabric to develop the intangible, almost intangible elements, which are quite hard to measure, that would support such changes. And those are around trust and capacity, relationship building, and knowing how that can shape or inform change. So I guess the participatory structures and the facilitation that enables partners and stakeholders to sort of build this trust, interpret the evidence, negotiate priorities together, and translate that data and governance assessment into shared action, allows that better communication and increased interoperability, collaboration, and coordination. So I think Tandem and Risk-Tandem are trying to provide important methodological support to those existing frameworks, such as the Regional Assessment Support Tool, for example, and the Regional Resilience Journey. So they're almost providing the what of the explaining and surfacing what is needed. And I would say these frameworks that we've described today are more about the how of doing that, to put it simply.
Yeah. Thank you, Sukaina. I think this was a really good summary, actually, of what we've learned today from the webinar. And I would like to thank all of our speakers and the Reworld Lab participants for sharing their experience and insights with us. And I'd like to thank all of you joining from across Europe and beyond. And if you'd like to find more information about the Directed project, recordings of previous webinars, and further resources, please visit our website under directedproject.eu. And let me say that we have our next webinar already planned in the Directed webinar series. It will be titled Data for Resilience, Building the Directed Data Fabric. And it will run on Friday, 26th of June at 1 a.m. Central European Time. And this session will explore how interoperable data systems, modeling tools, and digital infrastructure are being developed within the project to support disaster risk management and climate change adaptation across Europe. And finally, I'd like to thank Tracy Irvine, who led the development and the production of the Directed webinar series. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.